Welcome everybody today to the final speaker in our series in Learning the Language of Diversity and Meaningful Inclusion Project, which is a joint project between the Northern Plains Ethics Institute, of which I'm director, and the YWCA Cass Clay. We have some really strong sponsors of this event, including the Office of the President of NDSU, the NDSU College of Arts, Humanities, Social Sciences, the Department of Sociology and Anthropology, and our outside sponsor is Humanities North Dakota. So what I'm going to do is turn this over, but first, the moderator of the session is my Associate Director, Leanne Wolf, and the president of the university, to show his commitment to this project, besides helping to fund it, has introduced each of our speakers. So he will be doing that today. And for those of you who don't know him or who do know him, it is Dean Brashani. So I'm going to hand this over to Dean Brashani for his introduction. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Cooley, very gracious of you. And I want to thank everyone for joining us, and especially those sponsors, both from within North Dakota State University and outside of North Dakota State University. As those of you who have followed us through the year, this speaker series has been very important to improving and enhancing the culture on our campus, as well as in our local community and a growing nationwide audience of people that have tuned in for these presentations that have been provocative and varied beyond description. Kelly Wright's our speaker today. I'm very much looking forward to her presentation. Her research focuses on the link between linguistic production and perception. She applies mixed methodologies, including machine learning, massive corporate studies, perceptual and cognitive experimentation, and quantitative phonetics and qualitative sociolinguistic analysis. At this point, I want to turn it over to our speaker because she is going to be far more interesting than I would if I continue with a biography here. So Ms. Wright, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Dennis. Thank you all. I'm so excited to be here. I'm going to go ahead and share. So thank you so much. I like to start with positionality statements because I feel that they are a first step towards creating equity. And so I will say that I am Kelly Elizabeth Wright. I am a Black biracial cis woman from Appalachia. I'm a fourth-year PhD candidate. I am working class, and I am a second-generation student. In that, I mean, my father was an integrator. He was the first African-American student to attend the Catholic school we both went to. And so I am of the second generation of Black people that had access to public education. And I have committed myself to the full-scale decolonization of linguistics as a discipline. Today, I'm going to be talking to you about linguistic racism. I will give you a definition of that and walk through some examples in the early years of our nation. We'll talk about the creation of the American standard and its defaulting, how that became normal, and how the effects of that defaulting work in education across a few other institutions. I'll share the relevant portions of my research in media and housing. And then we'll pause and talk a little bit about inclusive language from the perspective of a linguist. And then we'll have about 30 minutes for this moderated question period. All right, I'm so excited. Oh, also, these slides will be shared later. So if you want them, you can email me or you'll find them where the video is posted. So linguistic racism is the linguistic violence, persecution, dehumanization, and marginalization that non-standard speakers experience in everyday life and across institutions. Today, we'll be talking about anti-Black linguistic racism because that is where my expertise lies. But of course, all of these examples that I give you here today are indicative of this wider phenomenon that impacts people of all non-white races in the US, but also across the globe. So we'll start by talking about the US Constitution. The Constitution doesn't mention the word slavery directly, right? But it does cover the institution in 2 articles. The first is a working out of the 3/5 compromise, which was a compromise between non-slaveholding and slaveholding states about how they were going to count these people in the census. Right. And so part of this compromise was that the importation of new enslaved peoples wouldn't be prohibited for another 20 years, right, until 1808. And they refer to them as such persons, right? So there is this important distinction made between citizen and person in the Constitution, right? And then the other article deals with anyone who has escaped, right? So people who are found in a free state would then be delivered up to their owners, right? They don't actually use the word owner. They say the party to whom such service or labor may be due, right? And so these 2 brief examples are indicative of how our founding documents deal with racism. And that is through euphemism, right? We're never really confronting it directly. We're sort of circumlocuting around it. This is kind of a common practice in the founding of our nation. So thinking about these people who are, seeking freedom, being like delivered back to enslavement, we come to the instantiation of what is now our modern policing system, which began as essentially privatized slave catchers or public slave catchers, right? And so what would happen is these owners would post advertisements. They would be in newspapers or on broadsheets, or they might even be read out by clergy after like a religious service. And they gave the public, people in the North, right, information about this escaped enslaved person's speech, among other identifying characteristics. And so what these look like are, here we have Sophia Gordon, this woman who has a low and soft manner of speech. Then on the right, we have Yet, who is this man who speaks low Dutch and, quote, broken English. And Fanny, a girl who speaks English and French. So essentially what we have is the public is transformed into this system of monitors, right, put in place across the country to pay attention to Black people's speech, right? So to identify them, to punish, imprison, or enforce them to work under the lash. Right. So in this situation, sounding like yourself could be life-threatening. Right. So taking again the example of this girl, Fanny, who speaks English and French, it's possible that she perhaps did not speak French in public and worked very hard to remove any traces of French from her English speaking voice to stay safe. Right. So keep this monitoring of Black speech in your mind as we go forward. Thinking about US citizenship, the key distinction between citizens and non-citizens in our Constitution is race, right? Citizens are described as fair-complexioned people of European descent, and any group of people that is now a citizen, right, or could be a citizen, that doesn't fall into that category was added through this process of naturalization, right? And so these cases go all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court decides, can this group be a citizen? And so we could talk about many cases, but I'm just going to share one with you today. That is the case of Ah Yup. He was a man from China who applied for citizenship, claiming that he was fair complexion, right, that he had whiteness, and he is denied. But the arguments in front of the court against him say that, quote, white person does not refer to color of skin, but instead an understanding in popular speech, acquired in the literature or common parlance. Right, so we can see that our lawmakers, our founders, right, are drawing this direct line between citizenship, whiteness, and standard language use. They are essentially at this point in time interchangeable. So this process of naturalization extends for, until the present day. So like from 230 years, we have these group-based amendments that bring other groups into, our body. So from another case, we have this quote, lesser peoples of Europe, their words, the German, Irish, and Poles can count as white because they, quote, quickly merge and lose the distinct hallmarks of their heritage, whereas Hindus retain marks of ethnicity indefinitely, particularly in accent, right? So we see this over and over as more people who sound less standard and therefore are less white, because again, they're the same thing, right, are brought in, the more that they are encouraged to assimilate, right? And for some of these people, assimilation can only progress to a certain point, right? And so we get this phenomenon called linguistic profiling, right? So it is this perceiving, right? So hearing these ethnicity markers or other identity markers in someone's voice, and then prejudicing them based on their language use, right? And this assimilation is required for citizenship, right? It's required for equal participation. And when you're not able to fully assimilate, there are negative outcomes. I just want to make a quick side point here that I'm talking about voice today, but this phenomenon is really amodal, right? In that spoken English is the standard. And so all people who use signed languages are at a disadvantage. We don't have time to cover that history today, but if you want to know more about it, ask for my rant on Alexander Graham Bell in the question period. Okay, so I want to talk now about standard English. Historically, a standard language arises from areas in power or large population centers. So for example, we have Parisian French being the standard of France, or the London dialect, like the Queen's English becoming the standard in the UK, right? But here, our standard is this area that's highlighted in blue, in dark blue, the inland north on this map. So this area, this is a modern map. So what we're talking about, in the 18th century is not as far west as Wisconsin and Illinois, right? A little farther south in Ohio. But this area becomes, the dialect of this area becomes the standard, not New York or Philadelphia, which were the areas of power and population in the country at the time. And the reason for that is xenophobia. And if you want to read more, read this whole book by Bonfiglio, right? It's a really good read. We had anti-immigrant sentiments, right? As people from all over the world started pouring in and filling up these cities, right? As the century progressed and we became more solidified, people did not want to sound like immigrants. And so our standard, or our preferred way of speaking and using language shifted towards the western frontier of Ohio, right? In this race neutral and ethnically marked variety of the inland north. And so now that we've established a variety, right, there's this whole process of standardizing it, right, of making it the default, the normal, the expected, right? So I just want to emphasize that this is not a natural process of language change, right? The standard variety is actually not acquired, right? Like a language, it is learned, right? It is a process of power. And so that's why I have the ization suffix highlighted here on the slide for you, is because I want to highlight that there is an actor, there's agency, there is a making and a doing of this defaulting, right? And so when we look at dictionaries, right, they codify and enforce like preferred pronunciations. They say what a word is and what it isn't, right? And so we see this over and over again, moving people towards that inland north pronunciation. Also, you could essentially pick up any etiquette book from our American history, and it will discourage the use of slang, slurred or accented speech. And it will show that the use of standard language really becomes associated with good breeding, right? And positive character traits. So it's not just about being understood, it's about who you are, right? We also, of course, in the literature are used to seeing what some people might call I dialect, right? So non-white people and dialect speakers are visually on the page placed in stark relief to our main characters, who almost always are using the standard, right? So there is a distance created. Of course, almost every style guide for writing this kind of work, right, will tell you to use the standard variety and give you some very specific rules for how to do that. So for the most part, what I've just covered was accessible to the upper classes, at least in the early years. But news, right, was open to everyone, first in print and later over the radio. So people would gather around the radio at night, right, listen to reports that were coming out in this variety, making them seem all the more normal and spreading the spoken variety even further across the expanding nation, right? So when we get to the point where we have televised news, Walter Cronkite really embodies this so-called non-regional diction that becomes the expected pattern of newscasting, right? As entertainment begins to grow, again, all of our main characters are, for the most part, using this variety. And if not, they're deviating for some specific purpose. So now that we, I hope, understand sort of how this defaulting works, I'm going to walk us through a number of examples of problems that it causes, right? Of people who either cannot produce or do not have access to that standard variety. So taking a few steps back, the United States is the only country to ever have anti-literacy laws that policed its own citizens. The 1739 Negro Act made it illegal to teach enslaved Blacks how to read. This act also codifies essentially everything that you can do with an enslaved person, and so therefore lists its punishments. Anti-literacy laws are on the books in the North until 1834, and in the South until Reconstruction, right? And keeping Black people from, learning and knowledge production is not just about this quote, an educated slave is a dangerous person. It's not just about the idea that they could rebel, right? It is because literacy specifically threatened the justification for enslavement, right? That Black people were less human, permanently illiterate, and dumb, right? So were they to learn, right, we couldn't force them into labor in the same way that was happening. Right, so keep that as like a background that it was illegal for Black people to even participate in the standard. So this idea, this defaulting, right, of the standard and expectations of assimilation really create deficit models. A deficit model is one where a deviation from the typical is seen as something needing to be fixed, right? And that this deviation is the fault of the individual or the group, not the system, right, that they are existing in. And so I want to talk about how we can see on the stage of education, right, this one way of doing things causing problems by looking at US imperialism, settler colonialism, and Jim Crow. So we have this image, which I feel like really encapsulates these ideas. I know you cannot read this caption. So we've got Uncle Sam, and it says, to his new class in civilization. Now, children, you've got to learn these lessons whether you want to or not. But just take a look at the class ahead of you and remember that in a little while, you will feel as glad to be here as they are, right? So we're directly encouraging assimilation and doing it through what is called the distinguishing civilizing factor, right, of white language or standard language. So in this image, we have in the front row recent acquisitions through US imperialism, Cuba, Puerto Rico, Hawaii, and the Philippines. And then behind them in the desks, we see acquisitions through settler colonialism, California, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and Alaska, right? And then there are three other figures represented here. At the end of Uncle Sam's pointer, we see a Native American who's pictured in this interstitial space. This is supposed to represent the boarding school system. Feel free to ask me more questions about that if you'd like. But you can see he's pictured as reading upside down. So it's the idea that you're part of education, but you're isolated and not really accessing language in its correct form, right? Then we have behind him a Chinese person who is like outside the door, prepared to come in, but still not welcomed into this educational space, right? And then the final figure is this Black man who is pictured as a worker, right? Who actually doesn't have access to the educational space at all. And so this really encapsulates this idea that assimilation is the point of education, is really the bedrock, right, that our modern system is built upon. So I want to now fast forward and talk about some cases that worked to build equity in this system and how those outcomes are different for so-called foreign language speakers and dialect speakers. So just a bit of background: Mexicans are considered of the white race under the US Constitution since the War of 1812. So part of that treaty allowed Mexicans to naturalize, and to naturalize, you were white, right? So in this case, we have Spanish-speaking children, who are placed in essentially special ed classes because they're not doing well in the English medium of instruction, right? And the parents sue and say that this is, unlawful segregation, and the courts agree, right? And this opens the door for Brown versus the Board of Education. So it's like a really important case. But so the courts agree, but listen to why, right? Quote, "The evidence clearly shows that Spanish-speaking children are retarded in learning English by lack of exposure to its use because of segregation, and that commingling of the entire student body instills and develops a common cultural attitude among the school children, which is imperative for the perpetuation of American institutions and ideals." Right? So they are noting this common cultural attitude, and that's important because it highlights the awareness of an intimate connection that language and identity share, and the idea that Spanish-speaking children who were accessing, the lessons, right, were able to learn math and science, right? That's not what they're worried about. They're more worried about developing a knowledge of English so that it can be those cultural identities, those American institutions and ideals that are upheld when they leave the education system. So we move forward then to this Lau v. Nichols decision. In 1971, the San Francisco school system was integrated, and it absorbed 3,000 Chinese students into an English-only medium of instruction. It was not long until those students were placed into special education classes. I'm gonna see. It was not long until those students were placed in English only special ed classes because of their difficulty matriculating in an English only medium, right? So their parents sue, and we get this goes all the way to the Supreme Court, and we end up getting this federal mandate for English language learning education, right? So to take appropriate action to overcome language barriers that impede equal participation by students. This mandate is set down to all districts that have a certain population percentage of, quote, or so-called foreign language students, right? And so I want to illustrate now the difference of how this works for Black English, right? So in Ann Arbor, we have the same thing happening, right? We've got Black kids in a small school district that are being placed in a special ed classes because of their difficulty in this English only medium of instruction, right? And their parents sued, saying this was segregation, right? And the legal tact that they take is seeking to extend this Lau v. Nichols decision to dialects, right? So we have this Equal Educational Opportunities Act. It says that people have to be provided, if there are language barriers, people have to be provided with education in this way, and that dialects operate the same way as languages, right? So you have linguists testifying in these cases saying, a language and a dialect, structurally and functionally, they are no different, right? Which is true. And that therefore they should be covered. The court is not convinced that dialects are the same as languages. They are. But they do decide that these students are under undue pressure and that a plan needs to be put in place, but just for this district, right? And this is the reason why, right, that they give that this needs to happen, is because children need to learn to speak and understand. Sorry, they did know how to do that, right? These Black children absolutely knew how to speak and understand. It's the instructors that didn't understand them, but okay. And to read and write the language used by society to carry on its business, to develop its science, arts, and culture, and to carry on its professions and governmental functions. Black language is not an acceptable method of communication in the educational world, in the commercial community, in the community of arts and science, or among professionals. It is largely a system that is used in casual and informal communication among the poor and lesser educated. Oh, it makes me so mad. I'm sorry, every time I read it. It is clear that lawmakers and educators find no value in Black language or the culture, identities, or ideas that it communicates from these statements, right? And I feel like it needs to be said that in 1974, Black people in all levels of society existed. Many of them had access to these varieties. Many of them were actively using them in these arenas that they are claiming are not acceptable, right? So this is the reason that they say these Black children need to be put back into the regular matriculation system, right? And, treated accordingly. And so their plan just for this district, right, is to make white instructors aware of the structure and function of Black English and then prepare students to code switch. That is not satisfactory, and we will see why in a little while. But I just want to highlight very quickly the difference that we see in the Oakland case. So this is perhaps more familiar. Some of you may know of it. And it's been covered really extensively in other places. So I'm not going to give you a lot of detail about the case, but essentially they take the opposite legal approach to arguing the case, that the Lau v. Nichols ruling should already cover Ebonics because it is a language in its own right. And so we even see linguists testify in front of Congress about this for this case, trying to explain how Black language has evolved and why it is different and how linguistically it is different in the ways we establish what a language is. And this legal argument also fails, right? So we come at this protection from both sides and see that it is not successful. Right. And so even these misguided and inequitable approaches that are adopted for these districts have never been nationally applied. Right. US dialect speakers still do not enjoy equal educational opportunities like English language learners do. Right. And this is a problem, right? And it further solidifies the defaulting of the standard, right? That Black English really just isn't even anything to some of these lawmakers. Okay, so we're going to move on and talk about some more of these institutions and address this concept of ratiolinguistic ideologies. So ratiolinguistic ideologies are a theoretical concept. They capture this reality that simply existing as a non-white person opens you up to linguistic discrimination, right? Irrespective of your objective linguistic practices, right? So it doesn't matter if I code switch to the standard, right? I am still a Black person, and therefore my language is perceived as deficient in some way by many listeners, right? Not all, many. So we see this play out in the legal arena. There are myriad examples. I'm just going to give you a few. So at the top here, we have Anita Hill pictured during her testimony for the Clarence Thomas confirmation hearings. She is a highly educated person. Her language to me sounds very standard, but her language was being picked apart, right? Because people were interested in her testimony, but also the way that she was saying things and how she was describing certain events were taken as not credible, right? Again, people monitoring very closely her language. And ultimately, her testimony didn't stop Clarence Thomas from being confirmed, right? And then we see Rachel Jeantel pictured here at the bottom. She was the main witness for the prosecution in the George Zimmerman trial for the murder of Trayvon Martin. Rachel Jeantel was on the phone with Trayvon Martin while he was being pursued by Zimmerman. Her language, she is a heavily accented speaker, right? And her language was like dinner table conversation. She was satirized by some of the late night hosts, right? Again, in the courtroom, her testimony took 3 days when it probably should have taken like 30 minutes. Everything she said was very closely picked apart. She was made to repeat herself over and over again. People from the jury stood up and asked her to repeat herself. And again, her language is being very closely monitored, right? Turns out that her testimony meant nothing to the jurors when they went in to make their decision. They reported afterwards. And that's covered very closely in this Rickford and King paper. We also see that court transcriptionists do very poorly when transcribing African-American language. So transcriptionists have to be certified at 95% accuracy, but when looking at African-American language, they only rise to the level of 59.5%, right? Jones et al. Report. This is a major issue because most of the misunderstandings are in this area of temporality or deixis, right? So you have someone who reports like, he be working, right? And that's translated as he was at work, right? But it means he has a job, right? So when the question of like an alibi or something comes up, or what someone did or didn't do, and these like functional phrases are not understood, we see and have seen and continue to see people going to jail, sometimes for life, because of these types of linguistic misunderstandings. And what's really important to think about is the transcript is the official record of the court, and that matters most on appeal. So a judge is presented with that official record when they sit down to review like the first case, right? That's all the information they have, is this official transcript. And so its accuracy is paramount, right? And this issue is not as much of an issue for so-called foreign language speakers in this country, right? Because they have a right to translation, whereas dialect speakers do not. So they are not protected in this way, but that has ensured, that people are understood from other linguistic backgrounds. So another example of misunderstanding Black language and racial linguistic ideologies and their consequences comes from policing. So we have very recently seen in the George Floyd or in the Derek Chauvin trial, this misunderstanding where George Floyd said, "I ain't do no drugs," and people heard, "I ate too many drugs," right? We don't know how this will affect the outcome, but it's possible that something like this might exonerate Chauvin. In Trayvon Martin's trial, again, it was reported that he said the words "creepy ass cracker," that he was being followed by a creepy ass cracker on the phone to Rachel Jeantel. It is this phrase that leads to George Zimmerman's acquittal, right? Because it is determined that George Zimmerman didn't commit a hate crime because Trayvon Martin is in fact the one who made it racial, right? By using this statement, and therefore Zimmerman was justified under Florida stand your ground law to take his life. And then the final example is from Sandra Bland, right? This quote, angry Black woman who copped an attitude and was arrested, right? This is why she was taken out of her vehicle. We see this in the video, and it's also very well covered in this Gillian and then Holiday, Burdine, and Tyler's 2015 works covering this. I encourage you to spend time with those documents. But yeah, so we see, misunderstandings of Black language and this expectation, right, of like anything that a Black person is saying is like equated with linguistic deficiency, having these real life consequences. So I want to move away from that now and talk to you about some examples from my research. All right, so we're transitioning from like how people are heard to how they are described. Right. So I built an 8.5 million word corpus of sports journalism, tracking 120 athletes over 108 years. And I developed with that text a machine learning algorithm that shows that athletes are described predictably differently by race. So what we find is that Black athletes are described with exceptionality and animalistic traits, while white athletes are described with like leadership or skill-based terms. Right, and one example of this comes from Serena Williams, pictured here, and all of these words were found to be racialized in the corpus. One example is this concept of semantic intensity, right? Serena Williams is called the GOAT, right? The greatest of all time at 22, right? And part of the reason why we hit that semantic ceiling for her very early, despite her obvious skill, right, is the avoidance of the "and she's Black" construction, right? Part of what made Serena Williams exceptional in her early career was that she was a young Black woman from Compton, right? And that she was succeeding in this, exclusive sport. It's not just that she played a great game, right? It's that she played an outstanding game, right? All of this stuff that sort of very quickly hits the ceiling of the semantic field, right? And the semantic intensity. Feel free to ask me more questions about that if you're interested. But this is just one example of how we see racialization working in the media. So moving then to talking about housing. US housing has always been separated along color and class lines, right? We had overt segregation in this country until the end of the Civil War. From the end of the Civil War to the passing of the Fair Housing Act. The Fair Housing Act protects people in all of these classes from housing discrimination. You can see it's been updated over time. But discrimination legally is an act that has to occur in physical proximity, right? So I have to stand in front of you for you to know that I'm a woman or a Black person, right? And so we ask, like, what about dialect discrimination? We know people can get this kind of information out of a voice. So how does that work on the phone? And so this is the exact question that Purnell, Izzardi, and Baugh are pursuing in their landmark study of housing discrimination in the Bay Area. We know that race is reflected auditorily, right? And listeners are incredibly good at, accurately identifying a speaker's race, right? Within milliseconds, we've already made that decision. And so this probability of social discrimination by auditory identification is really high, and they provide overwhelming and convincing evidence that this is happening, right, in the housing system. So where my work comes in is asking the question, can we see contemporary evidence of linguistic profiling in the housing market? And the answer is a resounding yes. It is absolutely still happening, despite the fact that not very many people engage with this market over the phone. More people are doing this kind of thing online, right? Despite the fact that the shape of the market has changed so much in those 20 intervening years, it's still essentially happening at the same rates as happening then. I'm not going to go through all of the steps of this audit study. If you're interested, I will share resources where I talk about it in detail. Please just follow up with me. But essentially, what we find is that whiter voices fare better, right? And I'm going to play these dialects for you in a moment, but we have mainstream US English and Southern American. And then the AEL voice, the Black voice, experiences lower commitment levels from landlords. So they say, call me back next week and we'll look at it. Or, you can go online and fill out some information, right? They don't actually make an appointment with you. And they also explicitly experience steering, which is illegal under the Fair Housing Act. And that's essentially when I call about property A, which may be in, an affluent neighborhood, but you show me or steer me towards property B, which is in like a traditionally redlined district or a Black neighborhood. So what I do want to talk to you about, right, is my innovation for this kind of study, and that is this inclusion of a social assessment survey, right? So it's not the landlords that are hearing these voices, it's people subsequently who are hearing recordings from those calls, right? But we're asking them questions, what race do you hear? What region do you think this person's from? And what kind of person do you think is speaking? So I speak 3 dialects: African American language, standardized American or Muse, mainstream US English, and Southern American, right? And they represent these aspects of my identity. I'm going to play them for you now. Hopefully it'll be loud enough.
Hello, I am calling about a house I saw for rent on Craigslist. Hello, I am calling about a house I saw for rent on Craigslist. Hi there, I am calling about a house I saw for rent on Craigslist.
All right. So now that you have a little bit of an idea of what they sound like, and again, these are clips like from the actual calls. All the ratings that I'm going to show you are based on those exact recordings. So what you've just heard. So for all these graphs, they're going to be organized in the same way, with the standard variety Muse in the middle and the other 2 non-standard varieties flanking it so that you can compare them to the ratings. So what we see for these race assignments is that the Muse voice is raised as white at 95%, so by almost all listeners. Then we have 92.5% for the Southern voice. So both of those are definitely white sounding. And the African American voice, which is at 62.5%, which is above chance, which is what we would expect. Right? So, okay, we know what race we think that these people are hearing. Let's now ask questions about what kind of person is speaking. So I had these participants rate each voice on 10 attribute characteristics, and they used a 100-point non-binary slider. That's important because we don't want to set up dichotomies. I've got like masculine and feminine in here, and I don't want to think about that as a continuum. I want to just think about masculinity, 0 to 100, right? So I realize this is a busy graph. We use violin plots like these so we can see every data point at a glance. And also, so we can make sure that there aren't outlier effects. So if we're just looking at the numbers, the like means and averages, sometimes it's really difficult to tell what our data is actually doing. So visualization is really helpful in this regard. So here I've circled this top right corner. We're going to focus in on education here. Again, it's organized with the standard voice in the middle in the green and the 2 other non-standard dialects on either side so that you can compare. What we're looking at here is the center of gravity. So you can see in this green bubble that the majority of the ratings are above 50%. They're really clustered up high, and you can tell that in its like shape. When we look over at the blue, at the Southern voice, its center of gravity is a little lower, right? You could draw like a diagonal line going down in between the 2. And it's got some ratings that are closer to 50% and a few lower ones, right? And then when we look at the African American voice, it's very distributed, right? There wasn't a lot of agreement on this one, except for we can see there's a lot more ratings below 50% than those other 2 dialects. So really setting up this 3-way distinction. When we move down and look at trustworthiness, right, we see that same pattern with the Muse voice having a high center of gravity, really compacted, not distributed. And then we see the Southern voice a little more distributed, the African American voice very spread out with some ratings near 0. And this is important because in a national survey of rental professionals that I did, we find that property managers cited trustworthiness as something they are specifically looking and listening for when engaging with potential tenants. So overall, the African American voice is rated the least pleasant, least trustworthy, least attractive, and least confident sounding. It is also the most poor, the most masculine, ask questions about that if you'd like, and the most difficult sounding, right? The standard voice is the most rich and the least poor, right? The most educated sounding, and it receives the most positively balanced ratings in all other categories. However, when we look at the Southern voice, the standard deviations make it ostensibly on par with Muse in terms of confident, masculine, feminine, difficult, trustworthy, and pleasant. I attribute this to the effect of the voice's indexation to whiteness. Its distinctiveness, however, plays out in its ratings for rich, poor, educated, and attractive. And I attribute this to the effect of non-standardness. So what these results tell us then is that intersectionality is really important, right? Because African American language speakers are stereotyped for race and non-standardness. We see that they're doubly impacted by linguistic discrimination, right? So we learn from this, not only are speakers able to assign accurate identities to voices very quickly, right, in a matter of seconds, but also in that same time, they build an entire character profile of a speaker in their heads, right? So we need to be, I guess, aware that we're doing this and kind of challenge ourselves when we're especially when we're interacting with people we don't personally know. So that's the examples that I have for you, right? I'm going to take this last moment to talk a little bit about inclusive language, which is not my specialty. So you're getting my opinion. Inclusive language is language that avoids the use of certain words that might exclude or target particular groups of people. This could be person first language, so saying a person with disabilities instead of disabled person. It might be degendered language, so flight attendant instead of stewardess, right? Or like a euphemism for offensive language, so unhoused persons instead of homeless or indigent, right? Thinking about these practices, a lot of these things we think about being included in statements or done in really public spaces. And I just want to emphasize that it is not really about that. It's about the practice of doing it, right? So every time you do the thing, it matters, right? So even if you are at home by yourself, even if you are only thinking the word flight attendant and not saying it aloud, that matters, because ideology and stereotypes live in the mind, right? And it is only through this a practice, like doing these things over and over again for ourselves and for our friends, right, that we begin to establish new defaults, right, and make these things like more accessible to wider publics, right? So just it does matter when you do it every time. So I want to think about like what happens next, right? So I want to say that you audience can do this, right? A lot of times when I present this work and I have conversations, a lot of people come up to me and they say, I don't feel like I'm the person to talk about this, right? I'd rather pass the mic to an expert like you instead of covering these topics on my own. And I just want you to be empowered, right, in your positions to make perceptible change. Everybody has power, especially those of us who have access to like microphones or podiums, right? Or who lead organizations. We can really be thinking about how we're using language and just observing it, right? Which is a step that many people don't take, right? Because we're so used to language, it's everywhere. So just be empowered in your position to make change, right? And one way to do that is to start by auditing your organizational history, policies, and practices. So that could look like a class assignment. It could look like something you do sort of in any station in life, right? You could look at a sports team that you're interested in. You could look at a religion that you practice, right? You could look at the school that you attend, the history of your city. Just understanding this organizational history and sort of how it fits into this wider landscape of linguistic racism and white supremacy and colonization, right? These ideas are not invisible. It really does just take the purposeful engagement with them, right? To really think about how to be inclusive, we have to think about how we've been exclusive, right? We can work together to end tone policing, right? So in these conversations where you have these well-intentioned people who are trying to point out these organizational issues and like history and like exclusion and all this stuff, the stuff we want to be aware about, in lots of these meetings, we see tone policing, which is this silencing tactic that suppresses dissent, genders emotions, and reinforces stereotypes. Often, it is like an ad hominem attack that focuses on tone rather than content. So that might be something like, you could say this without the attitude, or this isn't the space to express your emotions, or like calm down when a Black person is talking about systemic racism, right? Instead, we want to amplify voices, right, of people who are in the experiences of the minoritized. And that does mean holding space for people like you all are so generously doing for me today. But it could mean something as simple as like a retweet, right? So we can think about lots of ways to kind of intervene when this sort of thing is happening. We also want to work to combat phonocentrism, right? So language is more than sound, right? It is also text and sign. And so when we're thinking about how to be inclusive of other communities, it's not just allowing people to sound how they sound and respecting their accents, allowing them to produce content in a language that is accessible to them, right? It is also about letting people write in this way to respect and understand their text, and also to make sure that events, meetings, products that we're producing are subtitled and have sign language translation. These things can be very expensive, but it is incredibly important to realize that access is needed. We also want to do what we can to remove language use from evaluative criteria. This is probably the hardest one because it involves the most moving parts, right? But we want to remember that grammar is a raced, class, gendered, and colonized construction, right? And so removing language from evaluation in the classroom, in promotion, or in citizenship, like English only laws, right? Is very important to think about ways in which we can look at ideas and critical inquiry instead of the actual way that someone is expressing their ideas. And of course, we want to do the work of becoming advocates, right? So it's not just making sure that language as a concept, right, is present in diversity, equity, inclusion, and anti-racism statements. If these statements for your organization do not address language, they have not gone far enough, right? So that's very important. But it's also about calling your leaders and representatives. I know we have a long list of things we're calling our leaders and representatives about these days, but this is something to add to it. And in this paper, Craft It All, myself and my co-authors really walk through lots of examples about why groups like this are at risk. Right? So migrant and immigrant communities really don't have access to a lot of materials and languages that they can participate in. And so therefore they end up in like higher risk jobs and lots of other outcomes. We've already talked about the legal and criminal justice system. Healthcare is the same thing, right? People don't understand their diagnoses and they're like put at more risk, right? So just recognizing that access to information is a human right and that we give people access to information through language. And finally, I want to just hammer home this idea of a positionality statement. I modeled this for you at the beginning of this talk. I really do think that these are the best first step towards creating equity by just recognizing who we are, right? By standing in our positionality and saying, this is who is speaking to you, and giving people a better idea of who represents the organization, right? Of what the body of people look like. And so just being radically honest and transparent, I think is fundamental to liberation. And I am really excited to talk to you all about this further. Thank you so much. Special thanks to Dennis for getting me organized in the beginning. Really grateful for your time. And yeah, I look forward to your questions.
We are now moving into the question phase. And Dennis threw out one of our first questions. And that is, he wanted to talk a little bit about why was the African-American voice rated the most masculine?
Yeah, good question. I'm not sure that I can answer why, but I can tell you the effect that it has. African-American speech generally is masculinized. It's one of the things that is indexed to that speech. So women especially are said to sound more masculine, African-American women. This outcome, however, you might have imagined that a lot of these factors are correlated, right? Someone isn't going to simultaneously sound masculine and feminine, right? Or rich and poor at the same time. So when we do a factor analysis, we kind of see how they're interrelated and how they play up like or down each other. And so one point decrease or a 1 point increase in a masculinity rating, right? So you sound a slightly more masculine sounding feminine speaker equates to a 5 point reduction in trustworthiness, right? So this all important criteria for this particular context, just essentially being Black or sounding Black and being a woman and sounding more masculine translates into this 5 point reduction. So there was only a difference of 5 points across all the ratings, right? So the masculinity rating for African Americans was just 5 points lower than the standard voice, but that translates into a 20 point reduction in trustworthiness.
I was asking this came to mind too. And for those who teach writing, what tips do you have for addressing linguistic racism in our courses, particularly when we are preparing students for positions that uphold white mainstream English?
Yeah, great question. So I'll just start out by saying it is a challenge. And there are no right answers for how to do this. We're all working together to form these new ways. Being a linguist, I have the positionality that enables me to address these issues specifically, right? So a lot of the things that we've talked about today are whole sections of my course. So even in a regular writing course, I'm talking about the standardization and the white supremacist history of language and how it's been used to oppress people. I also talk about how we talk about code switching, we talk about access, but Black people, even if they're using the standard variety, still experience linguistic oppression amongst the other oppressions, right, that they experience in professional spaces. And so I think it is framing it more as a choice than a necessity, right? A lot of my students, I don't have, modality. I don't put modality restrictions on how people do their like final projects in my class. So they could, write an essay, they could do a podcast, they could do an op-ed, they could do something else, right? And I also don't grade grammar, right? So students might want to learn grammar rules. I give them the option to have their paper marked in this way, right? But it's never part of the grade, right? I'm more interested in, are you formatting citations correctly, right? Like that kind of usage. But if you want to learn about grammar, happy to talk to you about it. But it's never going to be part of how I'm grading you. And a lot of students take me up on it, right? They want to learn how to participate in language in this way. And that is a choice, right? But I think it is just framing it as such and giving them agency. And I'll cite a resource. April Baker Bell, her book, Linguistic Justice, really covers in detail how she works through these issues pedagogically. There's a whole list of demands for Black linguistic justice on her website, and it walks through stage by stage how to address these things in the classroom. Again, I'm coming from the anti-Black lens, but of course it applies to other linguistic traditions.
I want to make sure Lydia Nixon, did this give you what you were looking for? Because she was looking for resources, or papers about language and peer review process.
Yeah, there is, his name is Vershawn Young. And I can, if you want to follow up with me, I can share these resources with folks. But Vershawn Young writes, he has this peer-reviewed article about exactly this. And that peer-reviewed article is written in African-American language. So he is like doing the thing that he's talking about how and why we should do it. So it's a really incredible work. And I do have my students, my advanced linguistic students read that paper and we talk about it, but it is a great model for sort of how to get people to the point where they could even publish like peer-reviewed work in their own varieties. And a lot of it has to do with advocacy, at the publisher and editor level.
Kel Sassy also mentioned Felicia Rose Chavez's the Anti-Racist Writing Workshop, How to Decolonize the Creative Classroom. Have you heard of that? Is that a new resource for you?
That is a new resource for me. I haven't heard of that, and I think it sounds wonderful. I'd love to check it out.
Okay, here's another question. You want to ask this question, Dennis?
Right. Well, Joyanette had one way up earlier on. She wanted to know the date of the cartoon you showed with Uncle Sam.
1899.
I knew it had to be after 1898 because of the Spanish-American War.
Yes,
But
exactly. Yeah, 1899 political cartoon. Yeah.
when you're talking about language, I think folks don't realize how psychologically powerful that is, because we think in languages. The way we view the world is in the language we're using, especially how the language carves out reality for us. So when we had Kim Tallbear talking about colonization language and how that sometimes reduces us to binary way of thinking. So it's a psychological framework. Well, I'm an old guy, and it's hard to change language later in life. It's earlier to do it when you get kids. It's easier to do the languages. What do you suggest for us?
Yeah, great question. It's not too late is really the short answer. It's truly, we've seen this kind of thing, change really rapidly for a lot of people, especially like the feminist movement, and then, followed by like political correctness before it got like co-opted into how people use it today. Just the idea that we wanted to be inclusive, right? That's where we get like things like flight attendant. That kind of language, like male carrier, or chairperson, right? Like that is like second nature to a lot of people today. So that's just focusing in on like a single word, right? We can also think about, this movement around pronouns, and saying, just getting people to practice telling what your pronouns are and asking other people to call you that, like what you want to be called. A lot of people struggle with that, right? And especially older folks say like, this is the way I learned it and I'm not doing it, right? And or I can't do it, or I'm trying, but I'm not doing well, right? And I think this is where it comes back to practice, right? Just like any skill, right? It is about, doing it multiple times until it becomes sort of second nature. And you make an important point about this because this is exactly how our brain works, right? I mean, neurons that fire together wire together, right? So we have these pathways, literally meaning making pathways in our minds that link, like an action and a concept, right? Or a word and a feeling, right? So these things, it really is just doing it more and more. And even if you're, like I said, alone, right? This is like how you kind of set those pathways down over time. All it takes is just being purposeful about it. That's literally the only thing you have to do is care. So if you can get that far, you're doing great.
Tyler, would you like to ask your question, please?
My question is kind of referring to Dr. Holliday's paper, examining, you may be familiar, Barack and Michelle Obama's speech. I was just wondering, can you describe what coronal stop deletion is, and how often do people adjust their speech or dialect when they're around people that aren't their friends, that they don't know that well? Does it change based on group?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, so coronal stop deletion is essentially deleting like a D or a T, like a duh or a tuh at the end of a word. So you might get something like, like bankrupt instead of bankrupt, right? And so the coronal has to do with that word is about the area of the mouth that the sound is articulated in. And so coronal stop deletion is just a feature of African American English. Actually, it's a feature of casual speech. It's dialect independent for a lot of speakers, but it is indexed to African American language. So people might hear somebody who's not Black using that variant and it doesn't register. But for a Black person, they're like, oh, the monitor is on. I'm paying attention to it now. Really interesting how language works in that way. But so Holliday's work on Barack and Michelle Obama, really great work. She has a new paper that's recently come out that deals with this concept of sociolinguistic labor, right? And that is the idea of people who have like bicultural competence. And so Barack Obama is a wonderful example of that, right? He exists in all of these traditionally white spaces, but he also has, connection to Black culture, and so moves in between those aspects of his identity. And part of that movement is changing language, right? And part of that is just knowing the ways of doing things in other places, having access to jargon, right? But it's also about feeling comfortable and making sure that the people you're conversing with feel comfortable. And so moving, in between these varieties really has a lot to do with context. But we get down to some very fine level feature detail, right? Where we're looking at, the pronunciation of a consonant like on the computer screen, right? And that's where we see that there are some features that just never really shift, right? So it doesn't actually matter which context you're in, you kind of always sound accented in a certain way, right? And we know that, right, when we encounter speakers from like different countries, right, who kind of are here and sort of always have an accent no matter what they're doing, right? It might sound more formal or informal in different spaces, but retain some of those markers. And that's one marker, right, that we've seen that has this kind of staying power, is coronal stop deletion, among others. And in Holiday's work, it's especially about tone, right? Or the prosody, the flow of an utterance is another thing that is carried across context.
So how does that relate? It seems like it would relate to code switching as well.
Mhm.
Would you say a little bit more about that? What you see, what is code? Let's make sure everybody knows what code switching is and then how that connects.
Yeah, great question. So code switching has many definitions, right? Popularly and professionally. So many linguists would consider code switching only in a bilingual or multilingual context, where in one sentence or an utterance, you would start in language A, move to language B, and then finish in language A. So you're switching in between an utterance. And what's important there is you have someone who understands both languages, right, and can mix with you. So that's like the traditional linguistic definition of code switching. What a lot of people in the world, like NPR has like its code switch podcast, right? And we have like all this other references to code switching now in popular media. People think about that popularly as really anything. So it's not just the voice, but it might also be your dress or wearing your hair in a natural way or doing like these other things. And it's not just something that people of different races participate in, right? So, you might, be in a mixed religious family, right? Like married into a different religious background, right? And so like, so you can switch in a lot of different ways is the point. But linguistically, right, when we're talking about this concept, like what I was saying, the Obamas might be doing in their different roles, are really, Black people who kind of participate in higher education and then also, exist in their, cultural spaces, are using different language in both of those places. That's really what linguists call style shifting, because it's not a different language, right? It's not like moving between like French and German, right? It is, just moving in between this kind of like continuum of style. And that's something we all do, right? So it's not just about like Black people having access to multiple dialects and being able to move between them. It's like, we don't talk to our boss the same way we do to our best friend, right? And so this all kind of, in my opinion, sort of falls on a continuum where you have to have an audience that understands you to be able to mix, right? But your audience kind of determines where on your like repertoire of accessible styles you fall, like given what context you're in, right? And so yeah, it's very interesting. My dissertation is actually about exactly this, because I had this question of like, what is it? And like, what are people doing? And like, what's actually perceptible as a switch? So, stay tuned for more answers about that.
As you were talking, one of the things that came to mind was why people who have autism might struggle with that stylistic difference.
Yes. And why, you think about descriptions of any kind of, communicative, like a communication style in those groups, right? Like people talk about like flatness or like monotone or, like inappropriate uses of, or what's deemed inappropriate uses of like emotion, right? And it's absolutely because it takes reading a social situation to be able to kind of move fluidly on that stylistic continuum. And so, yes, it's something that is not easily accessible for, people with, different like neurotypicalities.
So one of the things that you said, if you wanted to get on a rant, I think you had 3 of them. Let's start with Alexander Graham Bell.
A monster. Okay. A monster. Alexander Graham Bell was, we know him as like this wonderful inventor, but he was also the chief proponent of the oralist school of education. So deaf children and people were sent to boarding schools, right? And that on its face doesn't seem like a bad thing, right? Because you can't access the mode of instruction, right? So you want to go to a place where you can. So like we still have deaf schools today, and that's not a problem. But the problem was they're trying to get deaf people to speak, right? So the oralist school is learn to speak, learn to speak standard English, even though you can't hear, right? So we now know that hearing and speech are linked, right? So we learn acquisition, like we acquire, the motor skills of speech through hearing. But Bell was convinced that it was just a motor issue, right? So that deaf people had no issues with the articulators and so therefore could learn. But the way that they learn is having their hands bound, even in their sleep. They were placed in front of mirrors and drilled in participation. They had to like hold their hands to like people's articulators, to their throats so they could feel like vibrations and stuff. And so instead of teaching, right, instead of, giving people access to language and actually learning in these schools, they're just essentially being tortured. The oralist school is still strong today. A lot of parents of deaf children are told by doctors and other medical professionals that they should not sign with their children, and that instead they should prepare, because that will hinder their ability to learn spoken English. And that is absolutely not the case, right? Learning language, acquiring language in any modality is what's going to speed, your acquisition of other languages. And that is a direct result of Alexander Graham Bell, who also was a eugenicist and thought that deaf people should not have children, even though 2 hearing people can have a deaf child. So yeah, he was a monster. Thanks for coming to my TED Talk.
So what about boarding schools? Your other rant that you asked to be reminded of.
So it really just comes back to this idea of assimilation. So Native American people, 30,000 Native American children in a span of 25 years were taken from reservations, my great-grandmother included, were taken from reservations and put into boarding schools. Some of these people never saw their families again. They were separated. Their linguistic groups were purposefully separated, which is the exact same thing that they did on slave ships. And they were punished for using their language. They were beaten, they were isolated. They had their mouths washed out, but also sometimes their tongues burnt so that they could not speak. And the whole goal of the boarding school was, again, not teaching, right? It is teaching American institutions and ideals. So you get, Native American women taught to play basketball, right? You get men like shaved and put into suits, right? And the idea was that they would either, they would become like domestic or industrial workers. So the forced removal from their cultural aspects and then being punished for using the language that they had access to, being forced to assimilate to American ways of living was like the entire project of the boarding school system.
Which raises the issue of the ongoing generational trauma, which we've only begun to understand. Well, I don't think we understand it. We're just starting to unpack what the impacts of it from language, from family groups and culture, and the decimation of all sorts of things that those boarding schools caused.
Yeah, and it's on top of an already like weakened linguistic systems, right, from colonization. So we lose, I mean, the level of like decimation that happened. I mean, we think about the population numbers, but the linguistic decimation was really incredible. I mean, on par with the greatest genocides, right? I mean, think about Alexander the Great, right, or Genghis Khan, like these people just sweeping through, and we're losing all this linguistic history, which is at the same time cultural history, right? And yeah, I just think it's really interesting because people argue, that language and identity and culture are not connected in the ways that we know them to be. But then you see projects like this that specifically seek to separate, right, people from their language and culture so that they can acquire another. And so there's this interesting duality to it.
So we have a question from Florin. Would you be willing to ask that, Florin?
Yes, thank you, Leanne. Thank you, Kelly, for this very insightful presentation. And I was just curious when I wrote that question. I could probably provide more, elaborate more if you want me to. But as I was listening to you, and I walked in late, so I'm not sure if you started how you started it. But I was wondering if just kind of connecting to your last few slides on empowering us to appreciate the value of all dialects and recognize the inherent value of them. I was just curious, why not present part of this presentation in an AAL dialect, right? So you can appreciate it, so we can promote it, because I think it's important for speakers of those dialects to begin the process of I don't know, mainstreaming it, so to speak, for lack of a better word. So I'm just curious why you chose to present everything in Muse rather than just, shift to other dialect that you're fluent in.
Yeah, great question. Oh my gosh, thank you for asking us. Not offensive at all. I don't know that I'm capable of presenting this work in my African American language. And part of that is because I really only use that variety with my family. Unfortunately, the majority of my Black family has passed away. So it is, my father and a couple cousins, and that's really it, right? And the Black spaces that I inhabit. But as an academic, and as a student for most of my life, I've been in predominantly white institutions. This is just my voice. It's my regular everyday voice. It's my professional voice. And I have at times thought about doing exactly that, because I know that with time I could make it right. But when I do it, it becomes really difficult to be natural in that dialect and not, at least to me, sound like something more of a caricature. So for example, in the housing study, right, where I use those three voices, it took months, right, for me to become comfortable in using my African American language just in a conversation with a stranger. I realized when I first started piloting that I have never done that before, right? I've never picked up the phone and just talked to someone that way, for all of these reasons, right? Because of how I'm worried about being perceived. Same thing though with like my Southern dialect. If I'm greeting like a bank teller, the lady at the checkout in the grocery store, like it's the Southern dialect that's coming out, because that is how I learned how to be polite, right? So it really has a lot to do with just my history with the variety. And I stopped piloting in the beginning and spent like a month using that dialect exclusively. I was reading my academic papers aloud in that voice. I did a couple presentations just in my like regular, discussion group in that voice. I used it every day. I use it on the phone, because it really took me a lot of time to inhabit it in my body and make it natural. And so that is just work I have not done yet in the professional space. It is absolutely an aspiration of mine for the exact reason you cite, that it's doing that normalizing work. And hopefully I will get there, but I'm just not there yet.
So Tyler, you have another question.
Yeah, I suppose I'm being greedy. This is a bit of a ignorant question. I didn't know, so I thought I would ask. How difficult would it be to have American Sign Language created as a standard? I don't know what would go into that. So just most people would be familiar and be able to communicate effectively in ASL. And what types of dialects or variances or like speech styles are within ASL?
Great question. So it would take a lot. And that's sort of what we see is, there was a couple decades ago, there was this push of getting people to learn Spanish, right? That everybody needed to learn Spanish. We were going to have a lot of Spanish speakers in the country and we wanted people to be bilingual, but that really fell off very quickly because there wasn't enough momentum. So it would take, like a significant political will, honestly, to collectively place the sign language learning in schools. It could be incentivized, right? There are lots of ways to do that, but it would sort of take teaching it. It's interesting too, because we see, like baby sign being a thing. So it's like parents of hearing children are encouraged to sign with their hearing children so that they can communicate sooner, but then we don't keep it up, right? So it's like, as soon as they start speaking, we're done signing. And maybe we have like cute little signs that we use together, right? So it might be something like instilling that practice, right? And like child rearing, making sign language part of that practice. But it would take a collective force of will, which is something that I don't see us mobilizing. Now, to your point, absolutely the same types of variation exist in signed languages as they do in spoken languages, which I think is really cool. So there's a lot of work. The scholar to look at is Joseph Hill. And he is really the preeminent scholar on Black ASL, which has its own history because, of course, Black people have experienced different educational histories, and therefore, the variety developed in different social circumstances and therefore is different. But yes, absolutely, accents are a thing in ASL. We also see, casual and informal stylistic differences, regional differences within families, right? So all the things that happen, all the variation that happens in spoken language also happens in sign languages. And there are sign languages in every country in the world, right? So, and a lot of them arise organically. So there are some traditions, actually a lot of indigenous traditions of sign languages, that was both, like people learn spoken and sign languages from birth at the beginning. And so that like modality, bimodal communication was like a standard. So that's sort of what we would have to achieve, is kind of collectively teaching it to everyone at the same time. Yeah, great question. And yeah, Joseph Hill, there's a video. It's Signing Black in America. And I can share that if people need access.
So one of the things that I find interesting is that it seems like in the United States, we almost have a general aversion to learning multiple languages, where in other parts of the world, people learn multiple languages in grade school. Mm-hmm. My cousin or my sister-in-law is from Norway, and she learned English, German, and French, as well as Norwegian, in grade school. So do you have any theories about why we have this aversion to other languages here?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I say this all the time. Most of the world is multilingual. So it's actually we're actually an exception in the United States, that most of our citizens end up being monolingual. We also see that changing. There's this thing called the 3-generation rule about like immigrants. So you have people who come here, don't have access to English. That second generation, knows both. They are bilingual with their parents and the wider world, and then their children are raised primarily English speaking. So by the 3rd generation, we're monolingual again, right? There is a lot of societal pressure to be multilingual. I don't know if there's necessarily like a reason for that aversion, except for some of the history that I presented today, right? That assimilationist policies are, embedded in the founding of this nation. And so the idea that using standard language was being a citizen and allows you to be entitled to equal participation, I think is very much the reason why we see a monolingual culture. And why, not to say that people who know multiple languages aren't intelligent, right? Or, but that we have this thing of like, he speaks 5 languages, and it's like the most amazing thing in the world, where it's like, okay, but have you been to Europe? Like, it's like most people speak at least 3 or 4, right? Or have access to them in some way, because it's just part of the culture, because, borders are open, and there's a lot more commingling of different varieties. So yeah, I think it's just our, socio-geographical circumstance is really a lot of it.
So we are coming to the end of our time. And I was just wondering if you had 2 things you wanted us to absolutely remember, what would those 2 things be?
Oh, goodness. I think one big takeaway is the standard was created, right? There's nothing objectively inherently good or better about it, right? It was just the people decided that this was the one we wanted to use. It could honestly have been German, right? I mean, it could have been a different language. And so I think, as we're sort of moving forward and thinking about the better, best, or appropriate ways to use language, it's really what is going to best express someone's ideas, and not necessarily defaulting to a standard. I think the other takeaway is really, we each individually have a lot of power. You may feel like these, ideas are like way outside of your wheelhouse, but we are all expert language users, right? We have a full-fledged system in our heads that operates really well. And so just kind of interrogating it and being more aware of how you use language and the way that you're perceiving other people, just taking the moment to recognize like the power that you have, I think is my biggest takeaway.
Thank you so much for your time today. Dennis, back to you.
And I want to thank you too. This was a wonderful way to wrap up the series that we have for learning the language of diversity and meaningful inclusion. And so all of our speakers were wonderful, and as you are for this, I want to thank one more time our sponsors, the NDSU Office of the President, the College of Arts, Humanities, Social Sciences, the Department of Sociology, Anthropology, and the Humanities North Dakota. And I also want to thank our partner, the Northern Plains Ethics Institute's partner, the YWCA Cass Clay, for all of the things that they have done, worked with us. And they're working on their Woman of the Year thing. So keep your eye out for that important work that they're doing. Anyways, thank you to everyone. And I hope you have a wonderful day. Doesn't look like snow today. And although you never know.